offers a wide range of internal growth. If you have a goal in mind and you put your mind to it, your successes can be endless.
There are so many jobs within this company that you can rotate into.
I like challenges. AgCountry gives me challenges.
Yeah, AgCountry is a great place to work. There's plenty of flexibility. You're never tied to your desk. There's a team here that is always there for you.
Yeah, grab your role and run with it, and always be aware of the opportunities because they're in front of you.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Big Iron. My name is Rob Frawning. I'm here with AgCountry Farm Credit Services, and I have Katie Tangen with me, marketing specialist from AgCountry as well. So today we're going to talk about the markets and what's kind of new and what's going on. Meant to be interactive, so please feel free to ask questions as you have them, and we'll try to address them the best that we can. So with that, I think I'll just kick it off a little bit, Katie. Obviously, we're a year removed from COVID, hopefully removed, but things were a lot different last year. A year ago, we sat up on this stage and we talked about markets, and we had just kind of started the rally that I would say we're still in a lot of the cases in the commodities. So just maybe a quick review of where we're at today and what's kind of new to start off.
Yeah, you're right. Compared to where we were last year at this time, we had just started to turn, and $5 corn seemed like, wow, are we really ever going to see that again? And now $5 corn is like, well, gee, we just had $5.50. I don't know how I feel about that. It's a lot different situation than what we've had. Obviously, we wouldn't have expected last year at this time to have the drought that we had, coming off of 2 pretty wet years. But balance sheets have kind of come back down in line. It seems like we've stabilized. We've gotten past that point that we were in June, where, gee, are we going to have enough crop to get through this year? So we've kind of relaxed that, but we're not to the point where we've gotten to harvest. So there's a little bit of risk premium. And then, we get real close to harvest, and we have a hurricane that runs right up the Gulf and starts to affect the loading system out of the Gulf of Mexico, particularly the grain system having some issues, which brings some basis challenges as we get into harvest.
Yeah, and relative to what we've seen in the last 5-6 years, basis right now is already pretty attractive in a lot of cases, but you're saying with this disruption we could possibly even see a little better basis than what we have today, or?
Well, here's where we get to the volatility part. Better basis might not pan out the way, I think last week I was in a meeting and a guy was sad he'd set 50 under basis on soybeans for harvest delivery. Any other year, 50 under at harvest, everyone would have been pretty excited, but now we look at it, and if you could brought corn into Hankinson last week, it was, I think, 90 or 95 over December. Beans at 30 under. So you had some really good basis. Now, does that get better from here? So here's what happens. When you had a hurricane, it come up, and actually the force of the wind was so powerful at one point, the Corps of Engineers said they actually had the Mississippi running backwards. that the wind just pushed it. And if you've seen pictures, Cargill's loading facility isn't going to be back online anytime in the near future. CHS has some issues. CHS and Cargill, interestingly enough, own a barge loading facility at the PNW together called Temco. CHS has said they're going to try to push most of their export sales for the time being out to the PNW, which is fine. Except if you look at a rail map, there's not a lot of rail system that goes from that same draw area. And BNSF is going to be the closest you're going to get. There are only so many cars to move that grain from here to there. So what you see is a big increase in freight. A lot of elevators here are already going to have their freight booked, so that it shouldn't affect them too much, except if they have to start moving more bushels than what they had planned on. So what I would expect is probably going to happen, you're going to have some elevators that plug a lot more quickly because you're going to have a slowdown in the turnaround on the cars. And if they have to book more, it's going to be a lot more expensive. But at that same time, we don't have as much crop as we normally have to handle either, which helps us out. So long term, I do think the basis is going to be pretty healthy for the 2021 crop. But as we get through harvest, I would expect some delays because of the logistic issues.
So kind of for the nearby and the crop coming, ripe here for harvest, we think we're going to have pretty supportive anyway, where the basis is at today, possibly a little better. You mentioned, short crop, obviously, we most of us have seen a drought in this area, limited, but for that reason as well, I think supports the basis, and some of these local elevators are going to want to try to be aggressive and pull some of these bushels from areas outside of their normal maybe to fill those rail cars, as you had mentioned. So absolutely, I do agree with that. Now, we just had an update last week on some yields. Do you want to share a little bit of insight on what the USDA did with some of the yields?
Yes, the USDA, in their report, they have crop production. They don't do a spring wheat yield in September because in 2 weeks we'll have a small grain summary, and that'll be the final number for spring wheat. So they didn't address that, but they did do corn and soybeans. And the way USDA's model works is it's just a simple trend line yield until we get to August. In August, they send out surveys to producers and they incorporate that data, and that is for August and September. Now next month they'll start incorporating some of the more objective yield, their actual samples and things like that. We did see an increase. It's still below trend line for corn. I will say beans is interesting because it was a 0.8 bushel drop in August off a trend line, which is kind of early for a bean yield to change, because remember their survey data is only through the first week or so of August. There's a little bit of a lag in there. And then September turns around and we come back up to a 50.4. I think there's some jostling that's going to happen on that soybean yield yet. I'm not going to say it's a disaster, because at one point in July, there were people who wouldn't have argued against a 49 bushel yield, and I think we're past that point. I think we're probably over 50. Corn, you're starting to hear yields come in from Missouri and Illinois, and disaster's a relative term. If we had 240 bushel corn, we would be jumping up and down. They have 240. They're like, this is not as good as I thought it could have been. There's kind of an inherent bias in that, because when you look good, you look really, really good. And when you look bad, you look really, really bad. And usually it's something in the middle. So we'll narrow that down. I don't think the corn yield is going to change a ton from where it's at right now. I think we're just on the short side of trend line, but not a disaster by any stretch.
Yeah, and I think sometimes the corn is a little bit more, could be a little bit easier to project by doing just some hand counts and stuff like that. Even this morning, as we were sitting at the AgCountry booth, I had a producer come up and he poked into some soybeans, and he was surprised it was already at 11% moisture, so already on the dry side. But he also said these rains on the earlier beans, the beans started to swell up and are popping pods. And so now we're dropping beans on the ground from an already tough crop. And obviously, this is it's a smaller geographical area than the whole U.S., but the drought was pretty widespread, and there's a lot of soybeans that are planted in that drought area. So some of these late rains, it'll be interesting to see if we actually lose some yield for those that were maybe already dead or had dried up, and those that hadn't, how much yield will they actually pick up? And I think that's going to be a hard one for the USDA to, I'll say guess, but to even know where that might be. So I think that until we get it in the bin and get it harvested, the soybean one could be interesting. And
soybeans are tougher that way. If you look at just crop conditions. So this is one point. USDA releases a crop condition every week. Those it's NAS surveys, they let it out. Their crop production number, totally independent from crop condition surveys. Those don't, they're different. You'd think looking at the crop conditions, well, if it says this, then we have to have this kind of yield, and it's just simply not the way it works. They don't include that. So that's one part, but then the other part is, even if you look at the crop conditions, corn, there's a pretty general trend where you start high and you might, you'll gradually go down, some years faster than others. Beans kind of stay steady, and then you see this split once you get to August, and they kind of go out wide, and they spread out, and however they spread out still not a great indicator of yield. Sometimes they look not so good, and they're still an okay crop. So it's hard, especially when you see that come out every week and say, oh, it's in bad shape, or maybe it improved 1%. That's not the same as their crop production number.
sure.
And it's hard to separate.
And again, keep in mind, this is interactive, so if you guys have any questions, raise your hand. I think there's a mic out there somewhere too, that if you want to ask, we'll certainly attempt to answer anything you may have. So feel free to do that. So, but talking a little bit on that yield, and I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but we all know that the agronomy guys are out there trying to lock in inputs for 2022. And we've seen some of those input prices fluctuate, obviously, from a year ago as well. Maybe want to touch base on, one, does the hurricane have some influence on those markets, or even just longer term, what we're looking at maybe on the fertilizer and some of the input costs?
So grain prices are the good news part of this, right? Now we have to talk about inputs. If there is a perfect storm of logistical nightmares that has fallen onto the fertilizer market, and if you tried to buy fertilizer right now, I think you could, but they're going to want you to take it. As a retailer, they don't want to say, yeah, I'm going to buy that, $700 urea, but I'm not going to pick it up until next spring, because that's too much risk for them. So if you can take it, that's fine. They might pay, they might store it for you for the handsome fee. But I think the really important part of this discussion is that we operate on a margin. It's prices versus your costs. So if you're going to lock in costs, then we probably need to sell some of the inputs as well and match them up as closely as we can. Now, if you're not going to buy your inputs, then be a little cautious with how you're going to sell, because the last thing we want is cheaper corn and high-priced fertilizer. And we've done that before, and it's not ugly. I mean, it's not something anyone wants to go through. And logistically, a lot of that fertilizer comes up from the Gulf. And a lot of it has to do with energy production. And that was the other thing with the hurricane. You have a whole bunch of crude oil and all that has got to shut down. And so now we got to get that restarted, and we got to get it moved back up. Mm-hmm. So November 1st is kind of the traditional start date for fertilizer season. I mean, right or wrong. And we should get there okay, but after that, I wouldn't, hold your breath. You're going to have it pretty well planned out. And make sure you communicate with your supplier. I think that's a big thing too. If you don't tell them you're going to want to put fertilizer on this fall, you can't get upset when they don't have it on hand in November. So I think communication goes a long way in smoothing this out.
Yeah, and you mentioned, high inputs and low revenue side of things. I mean, go back to 2012-13 and some of those. We all know those input costs go down a lot slower than the markets can. The markets can move pretty quick. Again, relative to where futures are at today, compared to where some of the input costs are, they're manageable. But like you said, if we lock in one, we probably want to make sure to look at locking in the other as well. And so we don't know which direction it's going to move specifically, or how far, and will it be correlated or not as well. So those are all good things to keep in mind, so.
I think one other point upon that is how does it affect next year's acreage mix? You know, you're going to have to start thinking about those things. So when we look forward to next year's balance sheet, does this mean we end up with more soybean acres? Because you just don't want the risk associated with having, you know, to put out money for corn and the higher fertilizer and higher fuel and things like that. So that is, I don't know if it's a worry in the market right now, but it is a consideration. You know, where's that balance? We don't get too far into the numbers until, you know, January, February, but a lot of those decisions are starting to be made now. And we have to keep that in mind, looking out for December 22 and November 22 soybeans. Is there some opportunity there? It's so easy to get wrapped up into this crop year, but really a lot of the premiums, when we start to turn the market lower, are going to show up a year ahead of time. And that's tough when you come off of the years like we had. That's, you know, kind of the pinch, because everyone sold ahead, right? $3.50 corn, well, we keep selling ahead, and then all of a sudden the price goes up and you feel like you did something wrong. You sold $4, you sold $4.50 corn, and you could have had $5.50. Well, here's the flip side of that. If you keep selling ahead, eventually the market comes down and you get the higher prices as we come down the other side. So I think there's something to be said to sticking with a method of selling, so you don't get that nasty flip over, well, I changed my mind, I don't want to do it this anyway, and then if I would have gone back the other way, I would have been okay.
Sure. And, you know, when we're talking 2022, I don't want to get ahead of harvest here either, but when we are looking at that, obviously there's a lot of different tools that can help mitigate some of that risk. So if you're already talking about acres and acre mix as far as what you might be looking at next year, there's some tools out there to help mitigate that 2022 revenue risk from now until harvest of next year. Again, whether you're using, you know, some kind of an options or future strategy, or even there's some new some crop insurance tools out there, some different products that maybe you want to talk to your crop insurance agent if you're not comfortable locking some things in. Make sure to reach out to them. I think there's some tools there from Margin Protection in Our Power that will actually let you lock in 2022 crop insurance prices where it's at today. And not waiting for that February average, because we don't know where we're going to be at in February. So just some food for thought there to keep that in mind. And if you want to lock in some of those prices where we know they're at decent prices today and can cover some of your expenses, then you have no delivery commitment or anything like that. But again, there's those other tools that if you want to take advantage of too, that might work for your operation. So bringing it back here a little bit to the 2021 crop as we're getting into harvest on some of those things. We talked about yield, and that can obviously fluctuate a little bit with where we're at, but we don't know what's out there. We'll see what we harvest, but as we get into that deferred months, we always hear about selling the carry. Where the market's at today, I mean, what are some of your thoughts on, do we put it in the bin, and will the bin pay for itself this year if we want to store it?
And right now, no. The way it's presented today, that was a weird flip over from having a carry to an inverted market. You know, we went through most of the past year where they paid you more to deliver today. And as a buyer, that makes a lot of sense. I need to make sure I have it today, so I'm going to basically penalize you for holding on to it. Well, if we have enough, and at least right now it looks like for corn we'll have sufficient carry, it's easy to look and say, well, July offers me 15 cents more if I hold it to July, or July offers me 25 cents more. That only applies if you sell it, because it's kind of like an escalator. We start today and we look at $5 corn. Well, if I hold on to it till July, it'll be $5.25. Well, we get to March, and now July is still higher, but it might be at $5.30. And then we get a little closer to July. Well, now they don't really need you to hold on to it anymore, so you're back at $5. And it's kind of this rolling, you can't ever catch up with it. So the only way to lock into a carry is to sell it. Now, do I think anyone should go right now and do that? No, because you gotta, how much is it going to cost you to hold on to it? What's the interest cost? Extra labor to put it in a bin. But you can start with December, and when we get to harvest, take a look at the markets. If you have room, and there's, usually I would say about 13, probably 15 cents now on corn to hold it till March, then roll it ahead. If it's not, bring it in today and we can, especially with the basis, in a lot of cases, a lot better than it's been. I don't think you're going to go too far wrong, looking at it that way. But you have to have it sold first, and that's kind of the trick to this whole thing that gets lost a lot of times.
Yeah, and again, primarily there, we're talking futures. Obviously, there's potential with basis, as we started the conversation off today with, pretty supportive of where basis are at, but there could be room for improvement. We even seen some people take some early corn because of just how much the basis was, as you mentioned, was it plus 90 or whatever, that maybe they can afford to pay to get it dried at that kind of a basis level. But
Well, and that, 95 over, if it's wet, yeah, they're going to shrink it, yeah. Do you really get too upset about the shrink at 95 over? That's a tough sell, I think, in a lot of cases. Obviously, it's got to be dry enough to cut. But, we had a dry year, and at least from what I've heard, the few acres have gotten taken off are drier than people would have thought. So we're closer to harvest, and it's one of those strange years for here. What if the corn comes off first? I mean, we have guys talking about that. It's not something we do here very often. That's more of a southern Illinois, Missouri, I'll take my corn and come back for the beans, but it's been so dry, and it affected more the corn because we got rain later on. The soybean plants don't really look, in some cases, like they want to give up the ghost. If we have to desiccate the beans even, well, do you want to put the extra expense into desiccating so you can take them first? Probably not, but
sure.
There are, cases where that might be best.
Again, don't be afraid to ask questions. Just raise your hand and we'll get you a mic on that. So, but again, we talked a lot of corn and soybeans. Roland, obviously, we're in the valley, North Dakota, northern Minnesota here as well. A lot of spring wheat. The biggest drought area was kind of right here in spring wheat country. So maybe a little bit on where the spring wheat market is at and what we got going on there.
Wheat is actually fun this year, and it's hard for me to say that. I don't like marketing wheat, but wheat is fun. And there's a lot of opportunity there that wasn't before. Obviously, like you said, in a lot of the drought areas, and I can't remember the numbers. At one point, I think 95% of the major spring wheat areas in a drought. Well, that's, basically North Dakota, northwest Minnesota, parts of Montana and South Dakota. Oddly enough, that drought didn't stop at the Canadian border. It kept going. Stats Canada had their numbers out this morning, and I didn't get to look at them too much. But from what it appears, North American spring wheat numbers, so the U.S. and Canada together, North American spring wheat supplies will be less than they are in 2007. Now, I say that very cautiously, because 2007 is when we had $20 wheat. Do I think we're going to have $20 wheat? No, I do not. I'm not saying that. 2007, we actually had a whole global shortage. Okay, it wasn't just Canada and North America, or in the U.S. that were short. It was everyone. And that's an oddity because wheat comes up about every other month somebody's harvesting. What it does mean is that our basis should be pretty well supported, and that our futures prices probably will be pretty supported until we get, February or March and have a better idea on winter wheat. It's obviously you can't totally trade one out for the other. Spring wheat has a very definite niche. But the other part about wheat prices that's a caution is wheat's not, you talk about price elasticity. If something's expensive, you buy less. If something's cheap, you buy more. Wheat doesn't necessarily follow the rules quite that way. It's a food product. People are going to eat if it's expensive. They're going to eat if it's cheap, and they're probably not going to change the mix too much. What that means is when we have high prices, it's harder to solve, but when we have low prices, it's harder to dig out of. And so we came out of that, 3, 4, 5 years where we had more wheat than we knew what to do with. Now we're at the flip side where we've come down to manageable levels. What does that mean for planting next spring? I mean, the prices have to stay high until the wheat's in the ground, and wheat's not everyone's favorite. I mean, it's easy, it fits a definite niche, but there's other ways to make money, too. So I think wheat has quite a bit of work to do. And then when you look globally, there's actually been an interesting change in Eastern Asian diets over the past few years, where they've always more favored rice. There's been definite growth in them adding more wheat to the diet. Bangladesh, Vietnam have both seen increasing demand. We did feel that demand until this year. Now we're high priced. And India is usually like their own little bubble. They grow what they have, they eat what they have, they don't typically share with anyone else, and we can write them off. They've actually been filling a lot of the niche into Bangladesh and into Vietnam in our absence. I don't think that's permanent, but what it does is provide support to that market long term, where we don't lose it and we don't see demand start to shift back to rice. We keep that wheat demand. So I think there are some constructive things with wheat. I don't want anyone thinking we're going to have $20 wheat, however.
So what I heard is $20 wheat.
Probably.
Okay, just curious. I think there was a not $20 wheat. But
not $20.
I heard $20 wheat is what I heard on that. So, but and obviously, like you said, there's.
And because of that, Rob's offering 18, but you got to meet for the truck back.
If we get to $20 wheat, I'll give you 18. That'll be just fine. If we get to 20, so that's a little bit of the wheat market here. How about in the energies? We'll touch on the energies a little bit before maybe we touch on livestock, but obviously a lot of discussion, from biodiesel to ethanol, and we saw the oil prices also escalate with some of this thing. Where are we kind of sitting from the energy perspective and how it's influencing our producers?
So as we come out of COVID, we have a growing economy, and part of having a growing economy is that you demand more energy, and we are seeing that. We've seen fuel prices, crude oil, diesel, all come up, which is healthy in a way if it's not our favorite part, but at least it means the economy's getting going. But for us specifically, we had an announcement, I don't remember if it was 2-3 months ago, that ADM is going to construct a crush plant at Spiritwood. I believe there's one in the works by Crookston. The Crookston plant I'm not totally familiar with, but I do know it's being constructed by Tangen, which means it's more than likely going to be a biodiesel plant. The one in Spiritwood was just kept as an ADM until maybe a month ago, and it was announced that ADM has made an agreement with Marathon Oil. It's a joint venture between ADM and Marathon, and the oil coming from that plant will all be sent to the refinery in Dickinson, which is good news. I mean, you kind of don't always like that it's going to one spot because you like to have a couple different outlets. But on the other hand, they didn't make the joint venture with the thought that this was going to collapse next year. There is a fair amount of work put into this and a fair amount of dedication to making sure this thing goes. And they're not the only ones. We've heard that with another plant in Illinois, and I can't remember who the refiner is on that one off the top of my head. But they have first right of refusal on every single last drop of oil that comes out of that plant. So we are seeing kind of a strange flip over where we've always watched meal for the price of beans, at least for the past 5 years. It wasn't always that way. But we're getting closer to the point where oil is the real driver and meal is the byproduct, which is different. I mean, it ultimately doesn't matter. You know, just as long as you know which one you're watching, who cares if it comes from the meal or the oil?
Sure.
I just think we're closer to the point where it's oil. Ethanol has its political challenges at times, but it's comfortable. I don't know if we're going to see a lot of new ethanol plants come up just now, but it's comfortable. Biodiesel does seem to be a pretty big push, and you can see that by there's specific RIN values attached to a biodiesel production, and you can see the value in that is reflected. The other part, at least for us here, is biodiesel is really any vegetable oil, right? We talk about beans, but sunflowers fit that, canola fits that. There's a whole lot of oil crops that go there. Mm-hmm. Canola's not had a great year because of the drought. Flowers are kind of meh. So there's a lot of support there locally for that push, and we have obviously quite a fair amount of canola crush for North Dakota.
And I think one thing to keep in mind too is another local demand for crops such as soybeans, where we saw what happened when China stopped buying. The vast majority of our soybeans go to the P&W and get shipped out, and normally would go to China. And I think it's not a huge percentage now that we added these couple of plants, but I think the more local demand that we can create, the better and more diversified we have as far as for a product that we're producing.
Well, maybe 6 years ago, we wanted crush plants so desperately for North Dakota, even South Dakota. In the past 2 years or 5 years, AGP has one in Aberdeen that's up and functional. It'll be a few more years before we get the one in Spiritwood, but that's a lot of new demand in a short amount of time, 10 years time, and that helps our basis, and it will continue to help our basis. This year we have a short crop year. You're right, a lot of this goes out the PNW. I mean, 80-some%, I don't even remember, 80-90% of North Dakota beans. When we're short, we have to pull from southern Minnesota into South Dakota. Well, at some point you get a line where now the basis has to pull it out of crusher hands, and we're kind of to that point, which is very supportive to our basis. And you don't want to ever hear about other producers having a tough time, but the fact of the matter is, when you have a drought, it means your prices get better. We don't want Brazil to suffer,
Right.
but
Better them than us?
better them than us.
Okay, I think we do have a question in the back.
Am I allowed to ask a question since I work at AgCountry?
How about if you ask the question, we'll tell you if it's allowed.
Oh, okay, very good. Katie, could you just touch a bit on biodiesel versus renewable diesel, the difference and the markets and the potential in the renewable diesel?
Yeah, it comes down to and they sound really a lot alike, right? When you say it, it's renewable diesel, biodiesel. One of them is a lot heavier on the refining process, and you should get more credit for it. The other one is basic. I'm not going to say that they totally just dump soy oil in, but it's pretty close. You can get going on that one a lot quicker because there's less technology, there's less infrastructure that has to take place, and I'm not totally sure. I think that's where the Spiritwood one is headed. Now, does that mean long-term we don't switch over to a more refined product that can go into more vehicles? No. This is the quick start, and the renewable is the longer-term goal. So there's a little bit of difference between the two. I think politically speaking, you're probably going to get more support for the renewable long-term, but right now, biodiesel will get us where we need to be.
Again, any other questions, feel free to raise your hand and we'll get you a mic. So,
Government subsidy go into renewable diesel.
That sounds like a Howard question, as long as he's got
I just read that jet fuel costs 5 times more to make out of soybean oil than it does out of crude oil.
There is, and that's kind of where the RINs credits come in too, is you get some value from producing it. But so this is the part about the biodiesel market that I haven't heard a lot of people talk about. Delta in particular was one where this happened to. So when you do accounting for, say, Delta and their refinery part, you can hold a certain amount of credit on your books for renewable fuels that you're supposed to do, but it's a payable until you do it. They sat on the payable, and it was a large amount of money. I mean, we're talking, I think, close to $1 billion. So when we had that renewable fuels EPA come out and say how much they need to blend and don't need to blend, and we're always like a year behind, there's kind of a thought process at this point because of the politics behind it. I can sit on this, and eventually it will go away. And that's what we've seen happen. Now, it feels a little bit like we're starting to switch the boat over to it's not going to get forgiven as quickly, but I don't think we're quite there. So I think at some point, if politically there's a will to do it, there's going to be a nasty backlash on some parts of the refiners, because you're going to end up at the end of the year sitting on books that have a really large payable that you thought was going to get forgiven. You're hoping government policy backs that up, but you don't know it until you get to the end of the year. And then your choices are to buy a bunch of RINs credits to get rid of it, or find the biofuel somewhere. As far as actually the cost of biodiesel to produce, you hear a lot of different things from, I'm not totally clear on if it's exactly 5 times or not.
Renewable diesel is completely
Yep,
This is renewable diesel, it costs 5 times
that I believe.
renewable diesel out of soybean oil.
And that makes sense, because it's a lot more technology intensive, it's a lot more pure I mean, that would make sense to me.
Who's gonna pay for that?
It's kind of the question we've always had with,
Yeah, and that's where I think you're probably right. For it to be completely competitive with the other options out there, we could definitely see some subsidy, and who's going to pay for that? Well, if the government decides to put the subsidy in, then we kind of know where it's going to come from, but.
yeah, I'm not totally sure. what's
I'm
in
not
it for
sure on that
but-
3.5 million, if it's in there or not, so.
3.5
Trillion, sorry.
It is a lot of
It
money.
is a lot of money, absolutely, so.
There's $1 trillion for renewable diesel.
That would be kind of nice, wouldn't
Well,
it?
yeah, I'm not sure if it's earmarked for $1 trillion of renewable fuel or not, so. Another question over in the back.
Okay, so after the hurricane, the basis got considerably better in our part of the world. How do you see that playing out as they come back online? Are we going to spread out right away, or is it just need to get booked and go through the P&W?
I think it kind of might depend on how long it takes them to come back online. If we get past, I'm going to say mid-October, end of October, I don't think we see much of a difference. I mean, I think we stay firm right the way through. And that was last week. I did a different presentation, and I don't even know why I decided to do it. Look at what the cash prices were. So James Valley and Verona was 35 over for corn. Savage was 25 under. Well, that's the river loader. And then you get down to West Memphis, which is the last stop before the hurricane, you're 60 under, which basically means the river is all flipped upside down. About 10% of Gulf exports move through the 2 elevators that are not going to be on right now. So that's why I'm kind of the cutoff is, if we get through harvest, I don't see it changing. It's really the rail traffic that has me concerned. And I don't think elevators in our area are going to struggle. They should have all had their freight booked. So I just don't have a lot of concern in our area other than the occasional plug because we can't get a car back.
Right. And the other thing I think you mentioned, Katie, the other day when we were talking about this too, is the elevators that aren't online down there, it's not just that, it's also barge traffic. I mean, the river, I don't remember what the term was, but was it a barge graveyard or something like that? There's other issues going down the river other than just the elevators loading.
The Corps of Army Corps, whatever statement I saw on it says the river is open, daylight hours only. There is a significant amount of partially sunken barges on the west bank. So I guess, if you want to get through it, go ahead. But it's not going to go fast. I mean, it takes so long. And you think about even building a house right now, getting the lumber and, steel and everything else takes a long time. Will they have more pull on some stuff? Yeah. But it's not going to be tomorrow.
And I think the good news is, I mean, like you said, if our elevators, most of them have the freight lined up, and the question will be is, do we plug their systems up? Again, a little bit tougher year on yield, so will they also be bidding for it to get those bushels? And then once they're full, what will that do to their basis? Once they're full, they can't take it. So I think those are things to keep in mind and keep a watchful eye on. Is every day could be different, and we'll see where your local elevator, where they're at in capacity, and that's definitely going to influence basis almost on a daily basis, to be quite honest. So.
And elevators, you always look at the base, well, gee, they have to be making so much money. Elevators don't, they make a little bit on the basis to keep themselves in business, but an elevator itself makes money on the handle. They only make a few cents, I can't remember the average is 2-3 cents. Their job is to flush as many bushels through the system as they possibly can. And they will move the price in whatever direction they have to accomplish that. So if we have to push it this way, our basis has to improve just to pull to get it. Like I said, logistically, every now and then you're going to get an off switch, which is where we get the volatile moves. But in general, the basis level should be better.
Great questions. Keep them coming if you have them. That's what we're here for. So if you got more questions, keep asking them. I know we're definitely in the heart of the valley here, but people travel a long ways to Big Iron. So just briefly, we'll touch on some livestock. Maybe just a little bit of insights on where the livestock. Oh, one more question. we'll go with that first.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing about livestock, but I was just thinking about, and you kind of mentioned it, Katie, with the drought and canola and flax kind of, we won't call it a failed crop, but is that really what's pushing the soybean market actually is we're focused on that oil market, and then if we don't have that oil, where's the meal going to come from? And now that influenced corn. I mean, we kind of get this domino effect going between these crops.
And that's just economics in general. It would be so easy if you could just pull one string, right? If I could just fix the one thing and not change anything else, this would go a lot smoother, but it's just not how it works, but you're right. I mean, when we end up short on canola, it does offer support to, any other crop. I think I'd worked at Cargill a long time ago, and it was kind of like everyone wants to work at the soy oil desk because soy oil doesn't move. It's like the easiest job in the world. You can sit there and trade $25 soy oil all day and not put any thought into it. And last spring, it was 70, 75 bucks. Now it's kind of settled down, but we're closer to 60. That's a big change for any market to stomach at once. I mean, budgets aren't set up for that. So you're right, it's a definite challenge, and it is supportive. But that's where you get to, do we lose exports at the amount of crush, and do we max out crush capacity, things like that.
And I should have let him ask the question first, because obviously that goes right into livestock. Obviously, what our prices are doing on our commodities with corn and soybeans, meal and others, is affecting our input costs for those guys raising livestock. So just a little brief update on talk about the hogs and the cattle maybe a little bit, just to give an idea where that's at and what's new in those markets.
Yeah, so cattle, it's a tough market. It's been a tough market for a long time. And obviously North Dakota, specifically with the drought this year, we have a lot of situations where producers have been forced to liquidate herds. And that's not generally a change that reverses itself next year. If I get to the point where I don't have feed, and that's usually the switch, if I can't get feed, I'm going to, sell the cows. Next year, do I suddenly turn around and say, I think I'm going to buy 500 cows back? Probably not. So you flush the cow herd. So locally, yeah, that should be supportive of cash prices at sale barns, especially this fall. Or winter. We've kind of had the fall run early. As far as the fat cattle market, that's had a lot of political challenges. I would go so far to say as the futures market isn't totally functional. And fixing that and this is the part that's tough, it's out of our control. We have to work with not to say we can't work through policy and we can't work through other channels to try to change it eventually, but the way it stands today, we can't change it. So we have to work with the prices we have, and there are some products, LRP helps. Mm-hmm. I do think there's something to be said for hedging futures, but you have to do it with the understanding that it may not be a totally accurate reflection of the market. And that is a challenge for the industry as a whole. Yesterday we had some fears because JBS in Grand Island had a fire, and you go back a year and a half, we had that other fire and everything crashed. Did we all crash this time? No. But really, the other part is labor for packing plants. You see the now hiring signs all over. Packing plants aren't any different. And it's not exactly glamorous work. So, that's another thing we're going to have to work through. And labor policy is kind of over my head, so I'm not going to go any deeper than that.
Sure. I hear you. It's over a lot of our heads as well. How about the hog market? How about that one?
Hog market seems pretty hell. I mean, obviously the past few days have been tough, but we're talking tough that we're going to 80 to 90 instead of 30 to 40 like we were. There's quite a bit of support for hogs. When you look at swine fever and things for China, they're better. I'm not going to go so far as to say they've totally solved the problem, because I do think you see little flare-ups. It's better than it was, and we should continue to export a decent amount.
Well, we covered a lot of different topics. Any parting thoughts for the group as far as for all of the commodities and stuff we talked about today?
It's managing the margin. Like I said, it's so easy to get caught up in $5 corn or $13 beans, but if the imports come up proportionally, you're kind of right back where you started, right? So we have to look at the margin. We have to make sure that we're hedging appropriately and that we manage both sides of that equation.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Again, feel free to come over to the AgCountry Fultz building. See us. We have all of our specialists over there covering a lot of different topics that AgCountry provides and hopefully can help you guys be successful into the future as well. So with that, safe harvest to everybody, and we hope to see you stop by our booth at the AgCountry Fultz building. Thank you very much.